Renowned as a global leader in tracing those invisible yet unyielding marks that guide us to the past, the University of Arizona stood as one of the most advanced institutions in the field of temporal dating. In the vast labyrinth of the past, where history's secrets lie beneath layers of dust and oblivion, one element becomes the guardian of time. Thanks to its mass accelerator laboratory, established in the early 1980s, the university had solidified its reputation as the go-to center for dating organic materials. Its leadership in radiocarbon dating was undeniable and respected worldwide. This method uses the radioactive isotope of carbon to determine the age of living tissues. All living beings contain carbon, including the unstable radiocarbon, which decays over time. While an organism lives, it maintains a constant equilibrium of carbon-14 by exchanging carbon with its environment through feeding or breathing. However, when it dies, that exchange halts, and the carbon-14 begins to decay into nitrogen at a constant rate. This process is called radioactive decay. Knowing that its half-life is 5,730 years, meaning half of the radiocarbon in organic material decays after this time, we can calculate how much time has passed since the organism's death by measuring the remaining carbon-14. Carbon is a witness to time, a storyteller that speaks of forgotten eras. Each atom is an echo of a vanished existence. Radiocarbon dating became a bridge to the past, and the University of Arizona's team was the foremost builder of such bridges. In 2009, the institution received a commission from Yale University, which had turned to them because their laboratory was renowned for ensuring precise and reliable results. This accuracy was crucial given the magnitude of the project. Yale was sending them a unique book, a manuscript safeguarded for decades in one of the most secure libraries in the world. The Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, a bastion of security where architectural design, cutting-edge technology, and rigorous preservation protocols converge to protect its treasures. The Beinecke Library houses around 700,000 volumes of incalculable historical value. Yet one book stood out above the rest. A peculiar medieval manuscript written in an unseen language. A secret code so complex that even the world's best cryptographers had failed to decipher it. No one had been able to translate or read a single word. Not a single letter. A manuscript that speaks in no known language, defying all interpretation and concealing its secrets with an almost tangible force. A book that has resisted centuries of frustration, christened as the Voynich Manuscript. Its 240 parchment pages are adorned with strange illustrations of plants, stars, women, and an alphabet that has been seen nowhere else on Earth. Its origin? Uncertain. Its content? Incomprehensible. For the first time since its acquisition in 1969, and after numerous bureaucratic battles, the Voynich Manuscript was to leave the library's walls to determine the period when it was written, a mystery that had remained unsolved for decades. Radiocarbon dating held the key. The parchment of the Voynich Manuscript was made from animal hide, likely calf or goat. These pages, being organic in nature, could be dated using carbon-14. By determining the year that animal died, they could approximate the period when the parchment was produced, and consequently the approximate date the book was written. The hopes of an entire community, of thousands of scholars and mystery enthusiasts, captivated by what is considered the strangest manuscript in the history of humanity, rested in their hands. They bore the responsibility of uncovering the date when this work was created. A new chapter in the story of the Voynich Manuscript was being written. The dawn of the 20th century came with a surge in philology, history, and archaeology. Exploring humanity's past had become an obsession for thousands of scholars, and ancient books were essential sources to fulfill those ambitions. Universities and libraries worldwide competed to acquire pieces that could shed light on eras lost in time. Collecting ancient books and manuscripts became a way to rescue and preserve cultural heritage. These objects held not only historical but also economic value, turning them into coveted relics that spurred the emergence of a growing network of antiquarians traveling across Europe in search of literary treasures. One of them was the Polish chemist and rare book dealer Wilfrid Michael Voynich, who arrived in the picturesque town of Frascati, southeast of Rome in 1912, determined to claim what he knew would be a bibliographic bounty. Voynich ran what was arguably the world's most prominent rare book trade business. With a particular talent for uncovering the most valuable and sought-after manuscripts, and a personal collection worth millions, he had a hunch that his next great find rested in the Jesuit villa of Mondragon, a significant cultural center with a vast anthology of ancient books. The members of the officially known Society of Jesus needed funds for their university, so they discreetly decided to sell some of their oldest texts, preserved in the villa for decades or even centuries. As he had done many times before, Voynich struck an extraordinarily advantageous deal and obtained a trunk containing 30 books, which he would add to his collection and later attempt to sell in London. Voynich sought books that captivated the eye, luxurious bindings, works radiating light through elaborate illustrations, books turned into luxuries. However, among all those books, his gaze fell on one that at first glance seemed unremarkable, a book he would later call the ugly duckling of the Jesuit collection. It was a small manuscript 22 by 15 centimeters, bound in goat leather that, against all odds, hid an unprecedented treasure. The book's 240 pages were filled with strikingly colorful drawings, hundreds of illustrations of strange plants, most of them impossible to identify, as though they depicted undiscovered species inspired by some real ones, astral charts, zodiacal drawings and constellations that don't even exist, an entire section where multiple naked pregnant women participate in strange ritual baths in a green liquid, alongside pages showing bizarre hybrids, plants with animal organs, or plants sprouting human heads. But as unusual as its graphics were, they paled in comparison to the true mysterious revelation. The manuscript was carefully handwritten in an unknown language, a tongue impossible to speak or read. An unrecognizable alphabet with clear legible words and letters but utterly indecipherable. With connections to the most renowned literary scholars and cryptography experts, Voynich assumed the manuscript must be some sort of code. The book had to contain a secret message. It wasn't an unknown language. Someone, for a reason that was impossible to determine, had hidden information within a cipher. The manuscript was an atlas of forbidden knowledge. Aware that he held what could potentially be the most valuable ancient book in history, a centuries-old relic hiding an encoded message, Voynich became consumed by a feverish obsession to unravel the nature of the treasure he had unearthed from a cemetery of time. Based on the materials used in the manuscript's creation, including the style of the ink and parchment, Voynich dated its origin to the 13th century and, despite its unreadable text, categorized it as belonging to natural philosophy, the discipline that studied the universe before the emergence of modern science. The estimated date, genre, and the fact that its contents were encrypted led Voynich to conclude that the book was a kind of secret manual for the practice of alchemy. a philosophical and proto-scientific discipline that flourished in Europe during the Middle Ages, laying the foundation for modern chemistry. Alchemists sought the transmutation of metals, turning common ones into gold or silver, which represented ideals of purity and perfection, and the creation of a mystical substance that would grant its possessor the gift of immortality, something they called the Philosopher's Stone. Voynich became convinced he held the work of an alchemist who had discovered the key to creating that substance, that the book concealed the path to the Philosopher's Stone, to eternal life. Knowledge that would have been persecuted by the Church, as it played with dangerous heretical ideas and defied the belief that only God could grant the soul's eternity. Voynich had to find a path to the book's author, and as if by fate, the manuscript itself opened that door. On the first page, he discovered a faded, nearly invisible scroll on the parchment. Using his chemistry background, he enhanced the ink, revealing the presence of a signature. The mark of Jacobus Horsicki de Tepanex. Also known as Sinapius, he was a Czech alchemist and botanist who became the head of the royal pharmacy in Prague, and a favorite of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II. The partially visible signature of the alchemist directly connected the manuscript to the emperor's court. This book had been part of the imperial collection, and had reached Tepanex's hands as a gift from Rudolf II. The next clue came through a letter written in 1665 by a Czech physician and scholar named Jan Marek Marci, sent to his friend and Jesuit priest Athanasius Kircher. In the letter, Marci announced he was in possession of a coded book he could not decipher, a manuscript that had been acquired by Rudolf II for 600 ducats, equivalent to 90,000 modern-day dollars, and which had allegedly been written by none other than Roger Bacon. The book Marci spoke of had to be the same one signed by Tepanex and part of Rudolf II's collection. And everything pointed to the same name. A man who perfectly fit the profile Voynich was seeking. One of the few in 13th century Europe still writing books on alchemy. Roger Bacon was an English philosopher and theologian of the Franciscan order. Today, he is revered as one of history's most important proto-scientists. But in his time, many of his contemporaries accused him of dabbling in dangerous heresies. Bacon was a monk obsessed with the Philosopher's Stone, and thus someone who stood against the Church's dogma. His Franciscan superiors kept a close watch on him. Fortunately for Bacon, he enjoyed the protection of the Pope. Pope Clement IV supported Bacon's intellectual pursuits. But after Clement's death in 1268, Bacon lost this protection. It was only a matter of time before the full weight of the Church came down on him. 2 years later, in 1270, the Paris condemnations banned the teaching of various philosophical doctrines and labeled their proponents as enemies of the Christian faith. At some point over the next 2 years, Bacon was imprisoned until his release in 1278. After his release, Bacon returned to his studies, but his writings focused solely on theological works. He published no further heretical teachings, unless he continued studying in secret. Perhaps he had discovered the Philosopher's Stone, the ultimate goal of alchemy, and documented everything in a coded book. A manuscript that somehow ended up in the hands of Emperor Rudolf II. After Bacon's death in 1292, Franciscan censorship and a general lack of interest in his ideas led to much of his literary legacy being lost. However, many of his works were preserved in Franciscan convent archives, awaiting rediscovery. In the 15th and 16th centuries, during the Renaissance's rise and the renewed interest in science and classical texts, some of Bacon's works were rediscovered. One of his greatest admirers was the English astrologer and occultist John Dee. As an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, Dee had access to many of Bacon's manuscripts, likely including that strange book. But Dee's connections extended beyond the British crown. He had a close relationship with Rudolf II. Records show Dee visited the emperor's court during his travels to Prague between 1583 and 1589 to exchange books with his library. It is highly probable that the person Rudolf II purchased the book from, for those 600 ducats, was John Dee, completing the puzzle. Voynich's narrative suggested that Roger Bacon had written a secret book after unlocking the key to obtaining the Philosopher's Stone, and with it, eternal life. The manuscript went unnoticed for 3 centuries after his death until John Dee rediscovered it in Bacon's collection. Realizing its value, Dee sold it to Rudolf II's court. Eventually, as a gift or a means of settling a debt, it reached the hands of Tepanex, who owned the manuscript before it passed to Marcy, the person who mentioned Bacon's authorship in the letter to his friend Kircher, the last known possessor of the work. The Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher received the manuscript to attempt its decipherment at the Collegio Romano, where he enjoyed a stellar reputation as an expert in ancient languages, cryptography, and esotericism. Whether or not he succeeded, we know that upon his death, the contents of his library became part of the Collegio Romano's archives. The Collegio Romano acted as a central repository for Jesuit teachings and research until 1873, nearly 2 centuries after Kircher's death, when the Italian government confiscated church property as part of the unification of Italy. This included the Collegio Romano Library's archives. During this process, many works were transferred to state institutions, but the more peculiar manuscripts were safeguarded, remaining under church control in other locations. One destination for many rescued books from the Collegio Romano was the Jesuit villa in Mondragon, Frascati, the very place where Voynich had acquired the manuscript. The story held together perfectly. There didn't appear to be any gaps in the impeccable chronological succession. However, if Voynich wanted the world to believe this was an original work by Bacon and make a fortune from it, he needed to crack its code, and he couldn't do it alone. Voynich presented the book at conferences and exhibitions, hoping to assemble a talented team of cryptographers to break its code. These lectures elevated his status in academic circles, and the manuscript, dubbed by the press as the Voynich Manuscript, became a mass phenomenon. Voynich and many of the world's top cryptography experts spent years trying to decipher the manuscript's secret writing, knowing that if decoded, it could be worth millions. Yet no one came close to transcribing a single word. It was the most complex code they had ever encountered, an exquisite piece of craftsmanship. Ultimately, Wilfrid Voynich died in 1930 at the age of 64, leaving the book to his wife Ethel, who owned it until her death in 1960. After changing hands several times, the manuscript finally came into the possession of Yale University in 1969, where it remained hidden, waiting for advancements in research. They were now responsible for continuing the work left by all those who came before them. A legacy of dreams and frustrations had led to this moment. It was time to make the book speak, to force it to confess the secret it had jealously guarded within its parchment, to reveal the true age of the Voynich manuscript. A few weeks later, the results of the carbon-14 dating arrived, and the conclusions, far from confirming the suspicions and intuitions of decades of study, completely overturned all prior assumptions. Voynich believed it was a 13th century text written by Roger Bacon. But the parchment through that radiocarbon analysis spoke of something entirely different. With 95% confidence, radiometric dating indicated that the material dated back to the early 15th century, specifically between 1404 and 1438, more than 140 years after Roger Bacon's death. The findings from the University of Arizona were reshaping everything. The authorship attributed to Bacon could not be upheld in any way. They could definitively state that the animal whose skin was used for the parchment was not alive during the time of the English alchemist. The researchers' task was complete. They had dated the Voynich Manuscript, providing the first concrete data about the book in more than 4 centuries. But they couldn't stop there. The story of this strange work had to be rewritten. A new author had to emerge from the shadows of the past. All they knew was that the animal whose skin became the parchment died sometime between 1404 and 1438. Carbon dating did not necessarily measure the moment the manuscript was illustrated. The parchment could have been written on at a later date, possibly even decades later. They had to ask themselves the same question Voynich had asked a century earlier. Who, in the 15th century, was both a writer and an illustrator? Who had an interest in alchemy and science, and above all, who wrote in code? Only one name came to mind: Leonardo da Vinci. In 2002, Dr. Edith Sherwood published an article comparing the Voynich manuscript with Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks and works. A connection that had never been deeply explored, as it was previously assumed the book was written in the 13th century. But now there was new evidence from carbon dating. The retired biomedical researcher began her dissertation with a detailed study of the handwriting. Both Da Vinci and the anonymous author of the manuscript used what is known as humanist lowercase script, a cartographic style developed in Italy during the Renaissance. It was designed to be clear and easy to read, with uniform spacing between words and harmoniously proportioned letters. This was markedly different from the writing style of the 13th century, dominated by Gothic script with angular, compact letters and tight strokes that made reading difficult. Sherwood had already noted that the style did not match the traditional dating of the manuscript. But beyond the script itself, there were other similarities to Da Vinci's writing. The lack of capital letters, the absence of punctuation marks, the separation of letters, with no connections or line breaks, not to mention Da Vinci's well-known habit of encoding the contents of his notebooks. Sherwood also focused on an astrological chart depicting the sign of Aries, with 15 nude women sitting in birthing tubs. Only one is shown as having given birth, with the baby resting in the water. This woman holds a braided thread, absent in the others, with a star at the end. According to Sherwood, this page, rather than being a zodiac illustration, was a birth certificate. Aries, the ram, represented the month of April. 15 women symbolized that the birth took place on the 15th, and the position of the only one who had given birth, imagining the chart as a clock, indicated 10 o'clock. Coincidentally or not, Leonardo da Vinci was born at 10 a.m. on April 15, 1452. Perhaps the Voynich manuscript was one of Da Vinci's earliest coded notebooks, a book in which he concealed one of his greatest secrets, potentially making the legacy of the greatest genius of all time even greater than we thought. However, there were too many inconsistencies in that theory. The style of the illustrations did not match Da Vinci's. The manuscript lacked the sophistication and anatomical detail characteristic of his works. The encryption system bore no resemblance to the documented methods he used to encode his works, with mirrored writing being his most common technique. And none of his notebooks contained a single reference to a project similar to the Voynich manuscript. Moreover, while it was possible for the parchment to have been stored for decades before being used, materials like this were extremely valuable at the time, and were typically used shortly after their manufacture. Even if the parchment dated back to 1438, storing it for nearly 50 years, until Da Vinci's adulthood, would have been unusual. Aware of the importance of dismissing a theory that could fuel conspiracies, the researchers obtained permission to analyze the manuscript's ink in the laboratory. This study suggested that the dyes were produced shortly after the parchment's manufacture. The strongest evidence indicated that the text was added shortly after the material was obtained from the animal. The Voynich Manuscript was created, and, as they now knew, written between 1404 and 1438. But the dating could provide no further answers. It was a span of over 30 years, during which any attempt to link it to contemporary authors would amount to little more than unfounded speculation. All hope rested on one unknown element. Everything hinged on deciphering the content of that enigmatic work for the first time. No one had yet been able to identify the language, the cipher used by the author, or how it could be translated. Since the key to its coding remains unknown, it is impossible to determine which phonological values, what sounds, correspond to each symbol. This makes it impossible to read or pronounce the written words, assuming the author did not invent entirely unpronounceable words. The only thing we know is that the text is written from left to right, suggesting a logical structure similar to many European languages. No human being has ever been able to decipher the manuscript's code. The remaining question was whether an artificial being would be able to do so. With the Voynich manuscript once again turned into a media phenomenon, a team of computer engineers at the University of Alberta in Canada embarked on a project to decode the book through a sophisticated artificial intelligence program. The study, led by Professor Greg Kondrak, aimed to use machine learning algorithms to analyze patterns and linguistic structures within the manuscript's text. The team was working on a program capable of recognizing, understanding, and analyzing any document in any language throughout history. They believed that with the right inputs, AI could even decipher a complex code in an unidentified language, precisely the case of the Voynich manuscript. The AI was programmed to recognize patterns and compare them with known languages, making it a potentially crucial and perhaps unique tool to solve the mystery. By inputting samples from 400 different languages, the artificial intelligence began inspecting the manuscript's text character by character, analyzing how often they repeated, how they were organized, how the words related to one another, and any linguistic nuance that might indicate the language in which it was written. Against all odds, the program provided a clear answer. The Voynich manuscript was written in Hebrew. The book's writing system appeared to be a kind of ciphered script that masked words in ancient Hebrew, a modification of the alphabet to make it unrecognizable to the eyes of anyone. At the same time, the program identified that the manuscript was written in what is known as an alphagram, a type of encoded language where the letters of a word are rearranged in alphabetical order. And as if that didn't make decoding it challenging enough, Hebrew lacks explicit vowels, preventing direct correspondence between symbols and sounds, thus slowing down or even rendering reliable translations impossible. For all these reasons, despite the progress, the manuscript's message could not be deciphered. All attempts at translation were self-fulfilling nonsense, aspirations rather than actual translations. Artificial intelligence had not provided definitive answers, and although it had identified linguistic patterns resembling Hebrew, no conclusive claims could be made. So many dead ends were leading researchers to a question that could change centuries-old paradigms. What if the reason no one had been able to decode the text was that there was never a code to begin with? What if the manuscript had never been encrypted? What if what we've always had before us was a language unto itself? In all the most famous ciphers in history, the symbols are spaced and separated from one another. When thinking about what to write, the author has to stop to encode it, letter by letter, word by word. But this wasn't observed in the manuscript. Whoever wrote it did so fluidly. They didn't stop to think about anything. They moved naturally, quickly and continuously from one letter to the next, with a natural and uninterrupted flow of the pen. And so it was across the 240 pages of the manuscript. They couldn't have done it while thinking about such a complex and unsolvable code. The author understood and spoke the language in which they were writing. A completely unprecedented language in history, seen only and exclusively in that book. When the theory that the manuscript was written in an unknown language rather than being a cipher of an existing one crossed the boundary of academic circles and reached the press and social media, conjectures spread across the media like wildfire. And among all the voices, one in particular resonated the most. Swiss author Erich von Däniken, known as one of the pioneers and main proponents of the pseudoscientific ancient astronauts hypothesis, captured all the media attention. Since the 1960s, von Däniken had argued that the gods and supernatural beings described in ancient mythologies and religious texts were actually extraterrestrials who at some point in the past interacted with humans. He claimed that many ancient monuments and artifacts could only have been built with the help of highly advanced technology provided by an alien civilization. Although his work has been criticized by archaeologists and historians for lacking academic rigor and being based on speculative interpretations rather than archaeological evidence, his books and lectures, where he asserted that the scientific community had overlooked or deliberately ignored evidence of these contacts, made him an immensely popular figure. And through the Voynich Manuscript, with the possibility that it represented a language unknown to humanity, he had everything he needed to bolster his hypothesis. Von Däniken suggested that the book was written by an alien astronaut who remained on Earth for a long age at some point in the 15th century, spending their life recording observations about humanity, fauna, and flora on that parchment. Hence the strange rituals in baths, behaviors the being couldn't fully understand, or the drawings of unidentifiable plants influenced by memories of the beings from their home world. Von Däniken claimed the Voynich Manuscript was nothing more than an alien's diary, written in the language of a civilization beyond Earth. The extraterrestrial hypothesis, however fascinating, obviously lacked scientific or logical grounding, but to prevent everything from falling into the dark realm of fantasy, they had to explain how it was possible for 240 pages of a manuscript to be written in an alphabet that has not been seen in any other historical work. And although finding an explanation for that unknown language seemed impossible, perhaps there was a path to piece it all together. A trail inhabited by angels and demons speaking through a possessed soul. Glossolalia, also known as the tongue of tongues, is a phenomenon where a person produces sounds or words that, while imitating speech, do not belong to any known language. Historically, this practice has been associated with altered states of consciousness or esoteric rituals. Perhaps the Voynich Manuscript was a written manifestation of one of these states, and it wouldn't be the first case in history. In the 12th century, German writer Hildegard von Bingen composed a work in which hundreds of pages were written in her own language. An artificial language Hildegard created to express spiritual and mystical concepts that, according to her, could not be communicated in common human tongues. This language, known as lingua ignota, unknown tongue in Latin, includes more than 1,000 words and its own alphabet, which she claimed to have received in visions and revelations directly from God. It represented her attempt to reflect the divine language she perceived in these visions. The lingua ignota was far more comprehensible than the language of the Voynich Manuscript, as its author left clues for understanding it, and the influence of existing languages was more apparent. But it had a precedent. The author of the Voynich Manuscript may have experienced a similar phenomenon through what is now known as automatic writing, which centuries ago was described as possessed writing. Mystical ecstasy or trance states induced by spiritual practices, hallucinogenic substances, or even mental illness could have brought the author into a state that, in the 15th century, might have been considered angelic or demonic possession, channeling what they believed were messages from a higher being, from heaven or hell. The manuscript could have been written in that trance state, with the author unconscious of what their hands were producing, pure subconsciousness poured onto parchment. This might explain its lack of association with any known language and the impression of spontaneous creation. The possession hypothesis might explain the consistent and uniform writing, with the author writing naturally, without pauses to plan the content, let alone encode it. They were unconcerned with the linguistic sense of the text. Thus, conventional decoding was impossible. They were simply channeling revelations from a supernatural entity. Although the theory made sense, there was no way to prove it, and counter-arguments quickly emerged. Many linguists who analyzed the novel hypothesis asserted that the manuscript structure was too complex. Statistical analyses had already shown patterns resembling natural languages, suggesting it could not be mere glossolalia or automatic writing. While a trance could explain the extreme creativity, it was difficult to imagine someone in that state maintaining such internal coherence across 240 pages. Similarly, the manuscript's illustrations were perfectly categorized into sections: botanical, astronomical, cosmological, biological, pharmacological, and a recipe book. This contradicted the chaotic nature of all documented trance writings. There was no spontaneity. The planning was evident. The consensus among scholars was that the Voynich manuscript exhibited too much coherence and planning to be entirely the product of an altered state of consciousness. It was more plausible that it was created with intent, a scientific, mystical, or even, as some speculated, in a moment of clarity, financial intent. Every path led to dead ends. Thousands of people tried to find patterns, ciphers, translations, linguistic origins, or even a connection to divine possession. But perhaps the answer was much simpler. Maybe the entire narrative was a hoax. One of the greatest frauds in history. A scam perpetrated by the very man after whom the manuscript is named. Wilfrid Voynich was a rare book dealer who depended on selling ancient texts and manuscripts to support his personal and family life. Creating or forging a mysterious manuscript in a unique, unknown language could have been the perfect marketing strategy to attract collectors' attention at the time. He had a financial motive for committing fraud. He traveled the world trying to convince scholars that he had discovered a lost and encoded work by Roger Bacon about the Philosopher's Stone. And of course, he wanted to sell it for a fortune. The theory that Voynich himself wrote the manuscript was gaining traction. Before he acquired it in 1912, there wasn't a single verifiable record of the manuscript's existence. Only a letter from Jan Marek Marci dating back to 1665. The letter merely mentioned that he possessed a mysterious, apparently indecipherable book allegedly written by Roger Bacon. It included no specific details to confirm it referred to the Voynich manuscript. It was even possible that Voynich first found the letter, and then created the manuscript to claim it was the lost work of Roger Bacon. The historical gaps surrounding the document were so vast, they could be evidence of a recent invention. Voynich was ambitious and shrewd. Fabricating the manuscript and then showcasing it to the world would elevate, and in fact did elevate, his reputation as an antiquarian. Although he claimed the manuscript had connections to historical figures like Rudolph II, those links were based more on speculation than direct evidence. The intricate web of connections could simply have been a strategy to legitimize and increase the manuscript's value. Moreover, Voynich's narrative seemed to shift over the years. In 1912, the year it was supposedly discovered, he claimed to have found it in a castle in southern Europe. By 1915, he unconsciously modified the story, placing the castle in Austria. Finally, after his wife's death in 1960, a letter surfaced revealing he had bought the manuscript from a Jesuit villa in Frascati, Italy, the official version of the story. The motive and these strange behaviors lent credibility to the hypothesis that the Voynich manuscript was a hoax. But if it were a forgery, it was an incredibly well-executed one. The materials dated back to the 15th century. The parchment was 600 years old, something Voynich couldn't have faked. It is filled with texts, drawings and diagrams, with pages of various sizes, some even forming foldouts. One would have to be a genius and an expert in ancient books to execute it that way. That Voynich was knowledgeable about ancient manuscripts was well known. Whether he was also a genius remained to be seen. The events should have unfolded as follows. At some point between 1908 and 1911, Voynich finds that letter from Marcy in which he asks his friend Kircher for help, deciphering a coded book that he believes was written by Roger Bacon. From there, Voynich would have set out to create a fake one. The first step would have been acquiring the parchments, and this is where one of the main counterarguments to the fraud hypothesis appears. Radiocarbon dating had confirmed that the parchment was made between 1404 and 1438, 500 years before Voynich allegedly wrote the manuscript. However, there was something that could give sense to it all. Just before the manuscript's sudden appearance, Voynich purchased an entire private collection from a bookstore in Florence. In total, more than 500,000 books, maps, pamphlets, and, as the records showed, parchment materials. It was likely that among all this inventory there was a large quantity of 15th century blank parchment. If so, Voynich would have had the canvas on which to paint his fraud. But there was one essential piece missing: the ink with which he wrote on that parchment. Laboratory analyses showed that due to its characteristics, the ink dated to a time very similar to the parchment's production. However, it had not been radiocarbon dated, as it was not an organic substance that could undergo that test. Everything came from the properties seen in 15th century inks. But if anyone could have fooled them, it was Voynich. Before becoming a prominent rare book dealer, he studied chemistry at the University of Warsaw. His chemical knowledge could have allowed him to replicate medieval inks with sufficient quality to evade modern analyses. In fact, he had repeatedly said that for many of the ancient books he acquired, he himself had manufactured the inks and pigments for their restoration. With the parchment and ink, along with extensive knowledge of the style and patterns of manuscripts from that period, all he would have needed was patience and time. In any case, if the manuscript was a forgery, nothing went as planned. He never managed to sell the book. People didn't want to buy the manuscript, they just wanted to decipher it. And yet, although the fraud theory seemed solid, there were challenges in supporting the idea. Radiocarbon dating would not only have confirmed the parchment's age, but it would have also detected signs of modern manipulation. Anachronistic organic materials not belonging to the dated period, and the analysis found no evidence of modern elements in the manuscript. Moreover, no matter how expert he was in ancient books, creating a manuscript with the structural and linguistic characteristics of the Voynich manuscript, a book that, 100 years later, still has no relation to any known language or code, would have required a large multidisciplinary team. Considering that the work of a single man was an overestimation of an antiquarian's capabilities. Above all, if Voynich indeed created the manuscript to sell it, why did he spend years researching its origin? Why did he die without seeing a single dollar from it? The economic motivation, considering the future of his life, was at least questionable. While it was possible that Voynich had access to ancient parchment, the theory that he used it to forge the manuscript faced too many significant objections. So much so that the consensus was reached that the Voynich Manuscript was genuine, a real book created in the 15th century, not a modern fraud. But even though we now recognize it as an authentic object, we still know nothing of its origin, its author, or the language in which it is written. Though there are fleeting connections to the court of Emperor Rudolf II, the exact path the manuscript took before reaching Voynich's hands is a complete mystery. There is also insufficient evidence to identify the author, and we don't know if the text is written in a known encrypted language, an unknown tongue, or if it's simply a case of automatic writing by a person in a trance. All hypotheses have had points in their favor and against them, but none have been proven. Once again, the Voynich manuscript leaves us with more questions than answers. A mirror of our obsession to understand what cannot be understood. A challenge to our logic and an enduring testimony to human creativity. Perhaps we will never understand what lies hidden between those parchments, but therein lies the true magic. The need to look beyond the obvious and accept that in mystery lies a beauty that does not need to be deciphered. Because as long as we keep contemplating it, the Voynich manuscript will live on as a legacy of our eternal quest for knowledge.